They arrested me with batons drawn for swimming in my own lake. But that arrest saved me from a $2.3 million HOA scam. I'm floating peacefully in water I legally own when 3 squad cars come screaming down the dirt road, sirens blaring like the world's ending. This psycho HOA president, bleached blonde, fake nails, attitude from hell, points at me like I'm some serial killer. There, arrest him! Officer draws his baton. Sir, exit the water now. Are you kidding me? I paid $180,000 for this lake at county auction. My deed's right there on the dock. But Karen here thinks screaming louder makes her right. The metallic taste of fear mixed with pure rage as they cuffed me on my own property. That's when I realized this wasn't about swimming. This was about power, money, and corruption. Their 911 call triggered a federal investigation that sent 3 people to prison and exposed the biggest HOA fraud in state history. Ever been arrested on your own property by power-hungry neighbors? Where are you watching from? Share your crazy neighbor stories below. You're probably wondering how a peaceful lake turned into a federal crime scene. Buckle up, because this story gets wilder than a tornado in a trailer park. My name's Dalton Rivers, and 6 months ago, I was just a 52-year-old retired Navy engineer trying to find some peace after a divorce that left me broke and broken. 26 years fixing nuclear submarines, followed by 10 years as a small-town handyman. I figured I'd earned the right to fish in quiet water without anyone telling me what to do. My old man passed last spring, God rest his soul, left me his life savings. Wasn't much, about $200,000 after funeral costs and Uncle Sam took his cut. But it was enough to buy something I'd been dreaming about since my Navy days. A place where the only authority figure was Mother Nature herself. That's when I found this hidden gem at the county auction. 47 acres surrounding a spring-fed lake so clear you could count coins on the bottom 20 feet down. Old-growth pines whispered secrets in the wind, and the morning mist rolled across the water like something out of a fairy tale. The cabin was rough, 1940s construction with plumbing that groaned like an arthritic sailor. But the lake? Pure magic. The smell of cedar and wet earth hit me the first time I walked that shoreline. Loons called across the water at dawn, their voices echoing off the far hills like nature's own reveille. For the first time in years, I could actually hear myself think instead of my ex-wife's voice telling me everything I was doing wrong. The auction paperwork seemed straightforward. Previous owner died intestate, no family to claim it. Property reverted to the county. Clean title, no liens, no complications. The auctioneer's hammer came down at $180,000, and I walked away with the deed that same afternoon. 47 acres of paradise, including mineral rights, and, this is the important part, exclusive lake access. The 1923 survey maps were crystal clear about the boundaries. Private lake, private shoreline, private dock rights. Everything north of Clearwater Creek belonged to me, fair and square. What I didn't know was that someone had been illegally collecting fees on my water for 20 years. For exactly 3 weeks, life was perfect. I'd wake up at sunrise with coffee on my creaky dock, watching eagles fish in the early morning light. The water was so clear you could see bass swimming lazy circles around the old wooden pilings. Pine needles crunched under my boots as I walked the property, planning where to build a better dock, maybe add a small workshop. Then I met the woman who would make my life hell and accidentally expose the biggest fraud in state history. Picture everything you hate about entitled suburban royalty, then add a law degree and multiply by 10. Vivian Whitmore was 58 years old with perfectly bleached blonde hair that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget. She wore designer clothes that screamed, "I sue people for sport," and drove a white BMW that looked like it had never seen a speck of dirt or honest work. I was hammering loose boards on my dock when I heard those expensive heels clicking across the planks like a metronome of doom. The sound cut through the peaceful morning like fingernails on a chalkboard, sending every bird within 50 yards into panicked flight. "Excuse me," she said in that voice wealthy people use when they're about to ruin your day. "This is private HOA property." I straightened up, wiping sawdust off my hands. "Ma'am, I think there's been a misunderstanding. I own this lake." Her laugh sounded like ice cubes clinking in an expensive martini glass. "I don't think so. I'm Vivian Whitmore, president of the Lakeshore Estates Homeowners Association. This lake belongs to our community." I walked to my truck and pulled out the deed, still crisp from the county recorder's office. The paper felt substantial between my weathered fingers, legal, official, and mine. "See for yourself, 47 acres, including the lake and all water rights." Her face went through several interesting color changes as she read. First confusion, then anger, Then something that looked like pure calculation mixed with the kind of rage rich people feel when the universe doesn't bend to their will. The scent of her overpowering perfume mixed with the clean lake breeze made my stomach turn. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. The BMW door slammed like a gunshot, echoing across the water. 48 hours later, I got my first taste of HOA warfare delivered by a process server who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else on Earth. "Dalton Rivers?" he asked, glancing nervously at my property like Vivian might be watching from the bushes. "That's me." He handed me a manila envelope thick enough to choke a horse. "You've been served. Have a nice day, sir." Inside was a formal trespass notice from the law firm of Bradshaw, Sterling and Associates, the kind of lawyers who charge $800 an hour to tell you the sky is blue. They demanded I immediately cease all lake access, pay $15,000 in damages and legal fees, and acknowledge that my deed was somehow incomplete and invalid. The letter smelled like expensive cologne and bullshit. But here's where Vivian made her first mistake. 26 years in the Navy teaches you that when someone starts shooting, you don't just duck. You shoot back with bigger guns. I remembered my old chief's advice. "Rivers, when bureaucrats come for you, hit them with their own paperwork." I drove straight to the county courthouse, a brick building that smelled like old coffee and broken dreams. That's where I met Ruby Hendricks, 78 years old with silver hair and the kind of sharp eyes that had seen every scam in the book. She'd been the county clerk for 43 years before retiring. "Honey," she said in a voice like gravel mixed with honey, "I recorded half these deeds myself. Let's see what we're dealing with." Ruby led me down to the basement archives, where dusty filing cabinets held the secrets of every property transaction going back to statehood. The musty smell of old paper and historical truth filled my nostrils as we dug through boxes. My dad always told me to research before you fight. Turns out courthouse records are gold mines that most people never bother to check. That's when we hit the jackpot. The original 1923 survey maps showed clear as day that Lakeshare Estates was built around my lake, not on it. But Ruby kept digging, and what she found made my jaw drop. The HOA's own founding documents from 1987, signed by Marcus Whitmore, Vivian's late father-in-law, specifically stated, "Lake property excluded from HOA jurisdiction and common areas." "Well, I'll be damned," Ruby whispered, her arthritic fingers tracing the signature. Marcus knew exactly what he was doing. But she wasn't done. Tucked behind the official documents was a handwritten note in Marcus's scrawl. "Lake to remain private property in perpetuity. HOA has no claim or authority over water rights." The crafty old bastard had covered his bases perfectly. I hired Jake Morrison that same afternoon. 34 years old, fresh off defeating a big developer who tried to steal a family farm. Jake charged $200 an hour compared to the HOA's $800 an hour sharks. He had the kind of hunger that comes from growing up poor and the legal skills that come from never backing down. "This is beautiful," Jake said, studying the documents. "They don't have a leg to stand on." He filed a motion for frivolous lawsuit dismissal, demanding the HOA pay my attorney fees for wasting everyone's time. Then he hit them with a public records request for every HOA board meeting minute mentioning the lake going back 20 years. The sound of Jake's printer spitting out legal documents was like music to my ears until his forensic accountant called with news that made my blood boil. "Dalton, you need to sit down for this," Jake said, his voice tight. "For 20 years, the HOA has been charging residents lake access fees of $200 per household annually. With 180 homes, that's $36,000 per year. I did the math. Jesus Christ, that's over $700,000. Gets worse. They've also been collecting marina maintenance fees and waterfront assessment charges. We're looking at close to $1.2 million they've stolen by selling access to your property." The taste of fury filled my mouth like copper pennies. They hadn't just tried to steal my lake. They'd been running a 20-year con game, charging their own residents for something they never owned. Ruby's gravelly laugh echoed through the courthouse basement. "That woman's been running a protection racket on your water, honey." But as Jake prepared our legal counterattack, his phone buzzed with a text from his accountant. His face went pale as he read. "What now?" I asked. "The Marina operation. It's not just about access fees." Jake's voice dropped to a whisper. "They've been operating a commercial marina without permits. My guy thinks this could be a federal issue." The word federal hung in the air like smoke from a distant fire. I didn't know it yet, but Vivian's little HOA power trip was about to become something much bigger. and much more dangerous for everyone involved. 3 days later, we hand-delivered our response to their fancy lawyers. I imagined them choking on their imported coffee when they realized their client had stepped in legal quicksand. But Vivian wasn't going down without a fight. Vivian's response came faster than a rattlesnake strike and twice as venomous. First, she called an emergency HOA meeting and convinced the board to authorize a $3,000 special assessment on every household to fund their legal defense. Imagine coming home to find out your neighbor just stuck you with a $3,000 bill to help steal someone else's property. The smell of desperation was thick as diesel fumes at that meeting, according to my one ally in Lakeshore Estates, an anonymous resident who started slipping me meeting minutes under my door like some suburban deep throat. But Vivian wasn't done flexing her dictator muscles. She hired a private investigator who looked like he'd been rejected from mall security, hoping to find dirt on me. This discount detective started showing up everywhere, lurking at the grocery store, sitting in his rusted Camaro at my driveway entrance, even following me to church like some stalker with a badge complex. Then the real psychological warfare began. Anonymous complaints flooded the building inspector's office about my unsafe cabin and environmental violations. Someone cut my dock lines in the middle of the night, twice. I woke up to find my boat floating loose, bumping against the far shore like a lost soul searching for home. The taste of morning coffee turned bitter as I realized this woman was willing to destroy everything around her to get what she wanted. But while Vivian played schoolyard bully, I was building something that would make her head spin. Jake introduced me to Dr. Sarah Theo, an environmental lawyer who specialized in waterway law. Sarah had the kind of sharp intelligence that cut through legal nonsense like a chainsaw through balsa wood. "Dalton, where does your lake water go?" she asked during our first meeting. I pulled out the survey maps pointing to a thin blue line. Small Creek flows out the north end, eventually hits the Susquehanna River system. Sarah's eyes lit up like she'd just struck oil. "Show me. Now." We spent that afternoon tracing Clearwater Creek from my lake through the woods to where it joined the larger waterway. What we found was pure legal dynamite. My spring-fed lake was part of a navigable water system connected to interstate commerce. I remembered something from my Navy days about federal jurisdiction, but Sarah knew the law cold. "Federal navigation servitude," she explained, barely containing her excitement. "If this water system is navigable, Uncle Sam trumps any local HOA rules. They can't control what the federal government owns." That's when Vivian made her biggest mistake yet. I was enjoying my usual morning swim, something I'd done peacefully for 6 weeks, when the world exploded in sirens and shouting. 3 squad cars came screaming down my dirt road like the apocalypse was chasing them, kicking up dust clouds that made the air taste like grit and panic. Vivian stood on my shoreline in designer heels and a white pantsuit, pointing at me like I was Charles Manson. "There! That's the armed trespasser. He threatened to kill me." Armed? I was wearing swim trunks and treading water 20 feet from shore. "Ma'am, step back," Officer Martinez called out, but his younger partner already had his baton drawn, adrenaline pumping like he was about to take down a terrorist cell. "Sir, exit the water immediately," the young cop shouted. "Keep your hands where we can see them." "Officer, this is my property," I called back, trying to stay calm. "My deed's in the truck right there." "Sir, we have reports of an armed individual refusing to leave private HOA property. Exit now or we'll come in after you." The metallic taste of handcuffs mixed with pure fury as they dragged me onto my own dock, water dripping from my body onto wood I'd repaired with my own hands. Vivian stood there with a smile that could freeze hellfire, watching them cuff me like I was some common criminal. "This is what happens to trespassers," she hissed as they loaded me into the squad car. But here's the beautiful twist that Vivian never saw coming. That arrest was the best thing that ever happened to my case. Officer Martinez was a good cop who actually read documents before filing reports. When he examined my deed and realized what had happened, the color drained from his face faster than water down a drain. He looked at Vivian like she was something he'd scrape off his boot. "Ma'am, this man owns this property. Why did you tell us he was armed and threatening?" "The HOA has rights here," she stammered, her composure cracking like thin ice. The charges were dropped 24 hours later. But that arrest report created an official paper trail of false police reports and harassment. More importantly, some federal bureaucrat reviewing the paperwork flagged my mention of navigable waterway jurisdiction for review. Suddenly, my little lake dispute had federal attention. The sound of Vivian's BMW tires squealing as she fled the scene told me she knew she'd screwed up royally, but she had no idea that her 911 call had just triggered a chain reaction that would bring down her entire criminal empire. While I was dealing with the humiliation of being arrested on my own property, Vivian doubled down on her campaign of terror like a general who'd lost her mind but kept her army. She hired an expert witness, some hack with a geology degree who'd testify that my lake was just an artificial retention pond with no legal water rights. This guy charged $500 an hour to lie with scientific-sounding words, the kind of professional bullshitter who makes honest people want to throw things at their TV. But Vivian's real masterpiece was getting the county to threaten condemnation of my property for public safety. Suddenly, my perfectly safe cabin was a fire hazard, my dock was structurally unsound, and my lake posed environmental risks to the community. The paperwork smelled like corruption and came with a deadline. Comply with $50,000 in mandatory improvements or face seizure under eminent domain. The woman was trying to steal my land using the government as her personal attack dog. Meanwhile, someone was playing dirty tricks that would make Nixon proud. Oil appeared in my lake overnight, creating rainbow slicks near my shoreline that made the water reek like a gas station bathroom. Anonymous tips flooded the EPA about environmental contamination from my property. My truck tires got slashed in the grocery store parking lot, and fake-for-sale signs kept appearing on my land like poisonous mushrooms after rain. The psychological pressure was intense. Half the town started treating me like a pariah, whispering and pointing when I walked into the hardware store. The other half quietly supported me, but were too scared of HOA retaliation to speak up. Nothing divides a community faster than watching bullies target someone who won't back down. That's when Sarah Theo's research hit pay dirt that would change everything. She'd been digging through federal archives like an archaeological treasure hunter, and what she found made my Navy heart sing with joy. In 1962, the Army Corps of Engineers had conducted a navigation study of the entire Susquehanna watershed. Buried in their findings was official classification of Clearwater Creek, and by extension, my lake, as waters of the United States, under federal jurisdiction. "Dalton, this is huge," Sarah said, spreading historical documents across Jake's conference table like battle plans. "Your lake has been under federal protection for over 60 years. The HOA's Marina has been operating illegally this entire time." But that wasn't even the best part. Sarah had found something that made Jake whistle like he'd won the lottery. The Army Corps study included detailed maps showing Native American canoe routes through the Waterway system. My lake wasn't just federally protected. It was part of ancestral Cherokee fishing grounds that had been used for transportation and commerce for over 200 years. Under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, any development near those sites required federal permits and tribal consultation. The HOA's Marina was built on sacred ground without permission from anyone who actually had authority to give it. While Sarah was building our federal case, Jake's forensic accountant was following the money trail like a bloodhound on fresh scent. What he found would have made Al Capone jealous. The HOA hadn't just been collecting illegal lake access fees. They'd been running a sophisticated fraud operation that would make Bernie Madoff proud. Over 8 years, they'd collected $240,000 in fake marina maintenance fees from residents. But here's the kicker that made my blood boil. Vivian's family construction company had received $1.9 million in no-bid contracts for emergency repairs that were never actually performed. Phantom projects with real invoices, paid for with resident assessments, and borrowed money secured against property values inflated by the illegal marina. The total fraud? $2.3 million stolen from their own neighbors over nearly a decade. "Jesus Christ," Jake muttered, staring at spreadsheets full of fabricated invoices. "This isn't just HOA overreach, this is organized crime." But the cherry on top of this corruption sundae was discovering that Vivian had personally received $15,000 annually as Marina coordinator for managing a facility she had no legal right to operate. She'd been paying herself to steal from her neighbors using my property as collateral. Ruby Hendricks delivered the final piece of the puzzle when she called with news that made everything click into place. While organizing old county files, she'd found a 1986 letter from Marcus Whitmore to the Army Corps of Engineers. Vivian's father-in-law had known the marina would need federal permits, but chose to sell the lake separately rather than deal with the regulatory nightmare. That clever old fox knew exactly what kind of legal minefield he was leaving behind, Ruby chuckled. He stuck his daughter-in-law with a federal crime, and she was too greedy to notice. The taste of victory was sweet as honey on my tongue. We didn't just have a property dispute anymore. We had documented federal crimes, archaeological violations, and enough fraud to send people to prison for years. Sarah made one phone call to her contacts at the Army Corps of Engineers. Within 48 hours, we had federal investigators assigned to the case, and Cherokee Nation lawyers filing protective claims over ancestral waters. Vivian had no idea that her little power trip was about to become a federal case study in HOA corruption. The smoking gun that would destroy Vivian's empire came wrapped in a manila folder that smelled like old tobacco and government secrets. Sarah Theo had been working her contacts at the Army Corps of Engineers like a master chess player, and her persistence paid off when a federal archivist found something buried in the 1962 navigation study files. What he discovered made our jaws drop harder than an anvil off a skyscraper. "Gentlemen, we have a problem," Sarah announced, spreading photocopied documents across Jake's conference table. Or rather, the HOA has a problem that's about to become a federal case. The documents were crystal clear. My lake had been officially classified as waters of the United States under the Clean Water Act since 1972. Every structure built in or around those waters required federal permits from multiple agencies. The HOA's Marina, built in 1995, had never applied for a single permit. But Ruby Hendricks delivered the knockout punch that turned this from a regulatory violation into a criminal conspiracy. She'd been playing detective in the county archives and found a letter that made everything click into place like a perfectly solved puzzle. In 1986, Marcus Whitmore had received official notice from the Army Corps that any marina construction would require extensive federal environmental permits, archaeological surveys, and tribal consultation. Instead of complying, the crafty old bastard had sold the lake separately and let his daughter-in-law inherit a federal crime. "Look at this," Ruby said, her voice crackling with excitement as she read Marcus's handwritten response to the Army Corps. He writes, "I am selling the lake property to avoid regulatory complications. Let the new owner deal with federal jurisdiction issues." Marcus Whitmore had known exactly what kind of legal landmine he was planting, and Vivian had been dancing on it for 20 years without realizing the fuse was already lit. The implications hit us like a freight train loaded with justice. The HOA hadn't just been operating without permits, they'd been running a commercial enterprise on federal waters while charging residents for access to something that legally belonged to Uncle Sam. Every boat slip rental, every marina fee, every waterfront assessment had been federal crimes in progress. Jake's forensic accountant had the numbers that made our case bulletproof. Over 20 years, the marina operation had generated $847,000 in direct revenue through slip rentals and fuel sales. Add in the indirect fees charged to residents, and we were looking at over $1.2 million in illegal commercial activity on federal waters. But the real bombshell was discovering that Vivian had used the marina as collateral for personal loans totaling $380,000. She'd been borrowing money against federal property she didn't own, which made it bank fraud on top of everything else. "This isn't just environmental violation anymore," Sarah explained, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "We're talking about commercial use of federal waters without permits, fraud, conspiracy, and potentially RICO charges for organized criminal activity." The taste of victory was sweet as mountain honey. But what happened next changed everything, from a civil dispute to a federal investigation that would shake the entire state. Sarah made one phone call to her former colleague at the Environmental Protection Agency. Within 6 hours, we had federal agents assigned to the case. Within 24 hours, the Cherokee Nation had filed emergency motions to protect ancestral waters from further commercial exploitation. But the moment that shifted all the power in our favor came when Agent Patricia Williams from the FBI's White-Collar Crime Division called Jake directly. "Mr. Morrison, we've reviewed the evidence your clients provided. We're opening a federal investigation into organized fraud and environmental crimes. Please advise your clients not to discuss this case with anyone outside your legal team." Suddenly, this wasn't Dalton Rivers versus the Lakeshore Estates HOA anymore. This was the United States of America versus a criminal conspiracy that had been operating in plain sight for 2 decades. Vivian had no idea that federal agents were already building a case that would send her to prison and destroy everything she'd spent years stealing from her own neighbors. What happened next felt like assembling the Avengers, except instead of fighting aliens, we were taking down suburban corruption with federal law and righteous fury. Sarah Theo became our strategic commander, coordinating between multiple federal agencies like a general planning D-Day. Jake handled the local legal warfare, Ruby served as our historical intelligence officer, and I became the guy who documented everything while trying not to get arrested again. But our team was about to get some serious reinforcements. Tom Brennan lived in a modest cabin across the lake and had been watching the HOA's shenanigans with the trained eye of someone who'd spent 30 years as an EPA inspector. The smell of his morning coffee mixed with righteous indignation when he knocked on my door 3 days after the federal investigation began. "Dalton, I've been biting my tongue for years about that Marina," he said, his weathered face grim as winter. "But if the feds are involved, it's time to speak up." Tom had documentation going back 15 years. Water quality violations, illegal fuel storage, unpermitted dock expansions, and contamination events that the HOA had covered up faster than a politician's scandal. He'd been keeping records like a one-man environmental surveillance operation, waiting for someone with the balls to challenge them. Then Maria Santos entered our war room like a guided missile with a press badge. This investigative journalist from the state capitol had been tracking HOA corruption cases across the region, and our federal case was exactly the kind of story that won Pulitzer Prizes and destroyed criminal conspiracies. "Gentlemen, you've stumbled onto something much bigger than one corrupt HOA," Maria announced, spreading files across Jake's conference table. "I've been documenting a pattern of HOA fraud across 3 counties. Your case could be the domino that brings down a whole network." But the addition that made me prouder than a new grandfather was Dr. James Clearwater, environmental scientist and Cherokee Nation historian. When the tribal council learned about the sacred fishing grounds being desecrated for profit, they didn't just file paperwork, they sent their best legal warrior to reclaim what had been stolen from their ancestors. "These waters have been sacred to my people for over 500 years, Dr. Clearwater explained, his voice carrying the weight of generations. "Your fight for property rights and our fight for cultural preservation are the same battle." Sarah coordinated our federal strategy like a master conductor leading a symphony of justice. She filed Freedom of Information Act requests that unlocked decades of government documents, revealing the true scope of federal jurisdiction over our waterway system. The papers arrived in boxes that smelled like bureaucracy and tasted like victory waiting to happen. My old Navy training kicked in as we organized our evidence like a military operation. I'd learned that attention to detail wins wars, whether you're fixing a nuclear submarine or exposing criminal conspiracies. Every photograph was dated and GPS tagged. Every document was copied and filed in multiple locations. Every conversation was recorded with full legal consent. Tom provided the technical expertise that turned our case from strong to bulletproof. His underwater surveys revealed marina pilings driven 15 feet into the lake bottom without any environmental impact studies. The sound of his sonar equipment mapping illegal structures was like a metallic heartbeat counting down to justice. Federal law became our weapon of choice, and Sarah taught us to wield it like legal samurai swords. The Clean Water Act carried fines of $25,000 per day for unpermitted discharges into federal waters. That's not a typo. 25 grand per day, every day, for 20 years. The math alone was enough to make accountants weep and criminals flee the country. But the Rivers and Harbors Act was our nuclear option. Any obstruction of navigable waters was a federal crime punishable by up to 5 years in prison. The HOA's marina wasn't just unpermitted. It was literally blocking federal navigation rights that dated back to the Civil War. Dr. Clearwater brought cultural weight that turned our property dispute into a moral crusade. Under the Archaeological Resources Protection Act, disturbing Native American sites on federal land carried automatic penalties and potential prison time. The marina had been built directly over Cherokee fishing camps that were older than European settlement of North America. Maria began building our media strategy for maximum public impact. Her investigation revealed that our case was connected to at least 12 other HOA corruption scandals across the region, all involving the same network of lawyers, contractors, and compliant local officials. The taste of statewide scandal was bitter as black coffee and twice as energizing. The technical knowledge we gathered would help homeowners across America fight similar battles. Federal waterway jurisdiction wasn't some obscure legal theory. It was a powerful tool that could override any local HOA authority over connected waters. If your community pond flows to a creek that eventually reaches navigable rivers, Uncle Sam might have more say than your neighborhood dictators. By the end of our planning phase, we had federal agencies, tribal authorities, environmental groups, and investigative journalists all working toward the same goal: complete destruction of Vivian's criminal empire and protection of federal waters from future exploitation. The smell of victory was getting stronger every day, but Vivian still had no idea that the federal government was about to drop on her like a ton of legal bricks. Vivian's response to the federal investigation was like watching a cornered animal lose its damn mind, desperate, dangerous, and completely detached from reality. Within 48 hours of Agent Williams's visit, she'd called an emergency board meeting and authorized a $50,000 legal defense fund, hiring a federal environmental attorney from D.C. who charged $1,200 per hour to tell wealthy criminals what they wanted to hear. The smell of desperation mixed with expensive cologne filled the Lakeshire Estates clubhouse as board members realized they weren't fighting some local handyman anymore. They were staring down the entire United States government. But Vivian's panic made her sloppy, and sloppy criminals make fatal mistakes. She started working her political connections like a telemarketer on commission, calling in favors from the county commissioner who lived in Lakeshire Estates, pressuring the sheriff whose brother-in-law sat on the HOA board, and even getting their pet state legislator to make informal inquiries about the federal investigation. What she didn't realize was that federal agents love it when local criminals try to use political pressure. It's like adding obstruction of justice charges to an already overflowing legal buffet. Meanwhile, someone was playing dirty tricks that would make Nixon's plumbers look like choir boys. Tom Brennan called me at dawn with news that made my blood boil hotter than a submarine reactor. "Dalton, someone dumped chemicals in the lake overnight," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "Looks like they're trying to kill the fish and blame environmental damage on your property." The morning air reeked of industrial solvent mixed with dead fish floating belly up near my shoreline. Anonymous tips flooded the EPA claiming I was running some kind of illegal chemical operation. But whoever planned this sabotage forgot that Tom Brennan had been catching environmental criminals for 3 decades. His water analysis proved the contamination came from the Marina side of the lake, and security cameras I'd installed after the arrest caught a familiar white BMW fleeing the scene at 3 a.m. The taste of corruption was literally poisoning my lake, but it was also providing evidence that would send someone to federal prison. Maria Santos hit the jackpot that turned our local corruption case into a statewide scandal bigger than a governor's sex tape. Her investigation revealed that Vivian's family construction company hadn't just been getting no-bid HOA contracts. They'd been running the same scam across 3 counties, using a network of corrupt HOA boards to launder money through fake emergency projects. "Dalton, this is massive," Maria said, spreading documents across my kitchen table like a detective solving a murder case. "We're looking at $8.2 million in fraudulent contracts across 14 different HOAs. Your case is the tip of an iceberg that could sink half the local political establishment." But the federal investigation was accelerating faster than a fighter jet on afterburners. Agent Williams called Jake with news that made our legal team feel like we'd won the lottery while watching our enemies get struck by lightning. The FBI had opened a full RICO investigation into organized HOA fraud. The Internal Revenue Service was examining 8 years of tax returns for unreported income from illegal marina operations. The Army Corps of Engineers was preparing criminal referrals for willful violations of federal environmental law. "Your client's case has triggered the biggest federal investigation of HOA corruption in state history," Agent Williams told Jake. "We're looking at potential prison sentences that could span decades." The political pressure campaign backfired spectacularly when federal investigators discovered that the county commissioner had been taking kickbacks from Vivian's construction company in exchange for fast-tracking permits. The sheriff's department was now under federal scrutiny for selective enforcement that protected HOA criminals while harassing their victims. Even their pet state legislator got burned when FBI agents found emails showing he'd received $25,000 in campaign contributions in exchange for trying to interfere with federal investigations. Nothing ends a political career faster than federal agents asking questions about bribery and corruption. But Vivian's desperation reached new heights when she tried to destroy evidence faster than a document shredder in a mafia trial. Tom's surveillance cameras caught HOA board members making midnight trips to the marina with boxes of documents, feeding papers into a burn barrel like they were destroying state secrets. Federal agents love it when criminals destroy evidence, because it adds obstruction charges and proves consciousness of guilt. Every document Vivian burned was another year added to her eventual prison sentence. The community was fracturing like ice under pressure, as residents realized their HOA fees had been funding a criminal enterprise for years. Half the neighborhood wanted Vivian's head on a pike, while her remaining supporters were quietly hiring their own lawyers and distancing themselves from the sinking ship. Property values were collapsing faster than a house of cards in a hurricane, as news of the federal investigation spread through real estate circles. Insurance companies were canceling policies left and right, afraid of being stuck with cleanup costs when the environmental crimes came to light. The smell of fear was thick as diesel smoke at every HOA gathering as board members realized they faced potential federal prison time for crimes they'd committed while playing suburban politics. Vivian had turned a simple property dispute into a federal case study in organized crime, and now the entire weight of the United States government was about to crash down on her perfectly manicured world. Vivian's final desperate gambit was like watching a train wreck in slow motion. You knew it was going to be catastrophic, but you couldn't look away from the spectacular destruction. She called a press conference outside the Lakeshore Estates clubhouse, surrounded by American flags and enough patriotic rhetoric to make George Washington roll over in his grave. Standing behind a podium that probably cost more than my monthly grocery budget, she launched into a speech that would have been hilarious if it wasn't so dangerously delusional. This is nothing less than a federal government conspiracy to steal private property from law-abiding Americans, she declared, her voice reaching the kind of shrill pitch that makes dogs howl and sensible people reach for earplugs. They're using environmental laws as weapons against our constitutional rights. The irony was thick enough to cut with a chainsaw. Here was a woman who'd been stealing from her neighbors for years, claiming to be the victim of government overreach while federal agents documented her crimes with the thoroughness of accountants preparing tax returns. Conservative talk radio picked up her story faster than vultures on roadkill, turning our local corruption case into a national debate about property rights versus federal environmental protection. The smell of media circus was in the air, mixed with the bitter taste of political opportunism and selective outrage. But while Vivian was playing victim on radio shows, the federal investigation was moving with the unstoppable momentum of an avalanche made of legal documents and criminal evidence. Cherokee Nation brought tribal police to establish a protective perimeter around the ancestral fishing grounds, their presence adding cultural weight that made this about more than money or property rights. Dr. Clearwater performed a water blessing ceremony that drew media attention from across the region, his words carrying the authority of 500 years of continuous connection to this land. These waters have been sacred to our people since before your European ancestors knew this continent existed, he told reporters, his voice carrying the quiet dignity that makes politicians look like screaming children. We will not allow them to be desecrated for profit any longer. The Army Corps of Engineers arrived with equipment that looked like something from a science fiction movie, conducting underwater surveys that revealed the full scope of environmental destruction. Their sonar mapping showed pilings driven 15 feet into the lake bottom without any environmental impact studies, creating underwater obstacles that violated federal navigation rights dating back to the 1800s. But Vivian's most spectacular mistake was trying to flee the country like some third-world dictator whose Swiss bank accounts had been frozen. Maria Santos broke the story that sent shockwaves through the community. Federal agents had flagged Vivian's passport after discovering she'd transferred $180,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. When she tried to board a flight to Mexico City, TSA agents detained her faster than a shoplifter at Christmas. The mugshot that appeared on every news channel showed a woman who'd gone from suburban royalty to federal fugitive in less than 6 months. Her perfectly styled blonde hair was disheveled, her designer makeup smeared with tears, and her eyes held the wild look of someone who'd finally realized the walls were closing in. Additional charges piled up like snow in a blizzard: flight risk, money laundering, tax evasion, and conspiracy to obstruct a federal investigation. Each new charge carried potential prison time that would keep her locked up until her great-grandchildren were collecting Social Security. The community meltdown was spectacular to watch from the safety of my own property. 3 more board members resigned rather than face federal prosecution, leaving behind resignation letters that read like confessions from criminals who'd suddenly found religion. The HOA's insurance company canceled all policies, afraid of being stuck with cleanup costs that could reach into the millions. Property values collapsed like a house of cards in a tornado as national media coverage turned Lakeshore Estates into a symbol of suburban corruption and environmental crime. Real estate agents were fielding calls from residents desperate to sell before federal liens attached to every property in the development. The Marina operation ceased immediately when federal marshals arrived with enough paperwork to choke a government bureaucrat. The sound of chains and padlocks echoing across the water was like music to my ears. 20 years of illegal commercial activity shut down in a single afternoon by federal agents who didn't care about local politics or suburban status symbols. But the moment that made everything worthwhile came when Agent Williams called with news that sent chills down my spine in the best possible way. "Mr. Rivers, we've completed our investigation. The federal grand jury has returned indictments against 11 individuals for conspiracy, fraud, environmental crimes, and violation of federal waterway laws. Mrs. Whitmore is looking at 23 federal felony counts with potential sentences exceeding 40 years in prison." The taste of complete victory was sweeter than honey mixed with justice and seasoned with righteous satisfaction. Vivian's attempt to steal my lake had triggered the largest federal investigation of HOA corruption in state history, exposing a criminal network that had been operating in plain sight for years. Tomorrow would bring the public confrontation that would end this war once and for all, with federal agents, tribal authorities, and national media all watching as justice finally arrived at Lakeshore Estates. The emergency community meeting at Lakeshore Estates looked like a cross between a congressional hearing and a public execution, with over 200 residents packed into a clubhouse designed for maybe 50 people on a good day. Federal agents positioned themselves around the room like silent sentinels in dark suits, their presence turning what should have been a neighborhood squabble into something that felt like a national security briefing. The air was thick with tension, expensive perfume, and the sour smell of fear sweat from people who'd suddenly realized their suburban paradise was built on federal crimes. Outside, media crews from 3 states had set up a circus of satellite trucks and camera equipment that made the place look like the site of a presidential assassination. The sound of news helicopters circling overhead mixed with the nervous chatter of residents who'd come to witness the final destruction of their HOA board. Colonel Patricia Hayes from the Army Corps of Engineers took the podium with the kind of military bearing that makes politicians wet themselves and criminals reconsider their life choices. Her voice cut through the nervous crowd chatter like a drill sergeant addressing new recruits. "Ladies and gentlemen, after a comprehensive federal investigation, we have determined that the Lakeshore Estates Marina has been operating illegally on waters of the United States for 23 years without required permits." The room erupted in gasps and nervous murmuring as the reality hit home. Their million-dollar marina was nothing more than an elaborate federal crime scene that had been generating evidence for 2 decades. The total fines assessed under the Clean Water Act, Rivers and Harbors Act, and Archaeological Resources Protection Act amount to $2.7 million, with additional criminal penalties pending trial. But Colonel Hayes wasn't done delivering body blows to Vivian's empire. She outlined violations that read like a catalog of environmental disasters: unpermitted fuel storage, contamination of federal waters, destruction of Native American archaeological sites, and obstruction of federal navigation rights that dated back to the Civil War. Dr. James Clearwater approached the podium next, carrying himself with the quiet dignity of someone whose ancestors had been fishing these waters when George Washington was still a British subject. His words carried the weight of 500 years of cultural connection that made property deeds look like yesterday's newspaper. "The Cherokee Nation formally reclaims stewardship of these ancestral waters," he announced, his voice echoing through the stunned silence. "Federal law recognizes our treaty rights to protect sacred sites from commercial exploitation." He unrolled a 200-year-old treaty map that showed Cherokee fishing camps and canoe routes through the exact waterway where the illegal marina had been built. The visual impact was devastating. These weren't just environmental violations. They were desecration of Native American heritage sites protected by federal law. That's when Vivian made her final, fatal mistake. Against her lawyer's desperate advice, she pushed her way to the podium like a woman possessed by demons and entitlement, her voice cracked with the kind of desperate fury that comes from watching your entire world collapse in real time. "This is America," she screamed, her face red enough to stop traffic. "Private property means something. These people have no right to steal what we built with our own money." The irony was so thick you could taste it like bitter medicine. Here was a woman who'd stolen $2.3 million from her own neighbors, claiming to be the victim of theft while federal agents documented her crimes with video cameras and court reporters. "The Cherokee Nation has no legitimate claim to property that's been privately owned for over a century," she continued, digging her legal grave deeper with every word. "This is nothing but a government conspiracy to destroy American property rights." That's when I stood up and walked to the podium, carrying a single document that would end this war with the precision of a sniper's bullet. The room fell silent as I unfolded the original 1923 deed, signed by Marcus Whitmore himself, Vivian's own father-in-law. My voice was calm as lake water on a windless morning, but it carried across that packed room like thunder rolling over the mountains. Mrs. Whitmore, your own family acknowledged federal jurisdiction over these waters 100 years ago. I read directly from Marcus's handwritten notation. Lake, subject to federal navigation servitude and tribal fishing rights as established by treaty law. Commercial development prohibited without federal permits and tribal consultation. The silence that followed was so complete you could have heard a pin drop in the parking lot. Vivian's face went through more color changes than a traffic light having a seizure, from red rage to white shock to green nausea, as she realized her own ancestor had documented the federal authorities she'd been denying. Your father-in-law knew this marina was illegal before it was ever built, I continued, my voice steady as bedrock. He left a paper trail that led federal agents right to your door. FBI agent Williams stepped forward with handcuffs that caught the clubhouse lights like jewelry made of justice. Vivian Whitmore, you're under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, money laundering, and violation of federal environmental laws. The sound of those handcuffs clicking shut echoed through the room like the final gavel in a murder trial, marking the end of 20 years of suburban tyranny and federal crime. 6 months later, justice was served, colder than a Minnesota winter and twice as satisfying. Vivian Whitmore was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison after pleading guilty to conspiracy, fraud, and environmental crimes. The judge showed about as much mercy as a rattlesnake in a daycare center, ordering full restitution of $2.3 million plus an additional $500,000 in fines. Her husband's divorce was finalized before she even got to prison, and their McMansion was foreclosed to pay victims who'd been robbed by their own HOA board. But the real victory wasn't Vivian's downfall. It was watching an entire community heal from years of corruption and fear. The new HOA board, elected in an emergency vote that saw 90% turnout, pledged complete transparency and legal compliance with everything from federal environmental law to basic human decency. Their first act was establishing a victim compensation fund using recovered assets from the criminal conspiracy that had masqueraded as community leadership. Property values recovered faster than a Navy SEAL from a hangover once national media coverage shifted from corruption scandal to environmental restoration success story. The federal cleanup of marina contamination turned the lake into a showcase of what happens when government agencies actually do their jobs right. Cherokee Nation established a cultural preserve on the eastern shoreline, creating an outdoor classroom where Dr. Clearwater teaches visitors about 500 years of sustainable fishing practices that white settlers could have learned instead of destroying. The smell of sage from their blessing ceremonies now mixes with pine-scented air that finally feels clean again. Tom Brennan leads weekly volunteer cleanup efforts that have restored water quality to levels not seen since the 1950s. His environmental monitoring program became a model that other communities use to detect illegal pollution before it becomes a federal crime scene. Watching retired engineers and suburban soccer moms working together to protect our shared waters gives me more hope for America than any politician's speech. The legal precedent we established helps homeowners across the country fight similar battles against corrupt HOAs. Federal court ruling in Rivers versus Lakeshore HOA is now cited in law school textbooks as proof that federal environmental law trumps local authority when waters connect to interstate commerce. If your community pond flows to a creek that eventually reaches navigable rivers, Uncle Sam has more say than your neighborhood dictators. That's a knowledge nugget worth remembering. Cherokee Nation's successful assertion of treaty rights over ancestral waters strengthened tribal authority across the entire region. Other communities with Native American heritage sites now have legal ammunition to fight inappropriate development, proving that respecting indigenous rights isn't just morally right, it's legally powerful. I established the Veterans on the Water program, using my lake for PTSD therapy sessions that help former military personnel find the same peace that drew me here originally. There's something about floating in clear water surrounded by whispering pines that heals wounds you can't see on x-rays. The program has helped 43 veterans so far, with waiting lists that stretch into next year. Sarah Theo and I found something better than legal victory together. We found love forged in the fires of fighting corruption and environmental crime. She moved into the cabin last month, bringing her legal expertise and a laugh that makes morning coffee taste like liquid sunshine. Ruby Hendricks has become the grandmother neither of us had, teaching Sarah to fish and sharing stories that connect us to this land's real history. The scholarship fund we established sends Native American students to law school with a focus on environmental protection and tribal rights. 3 students have graduated so far, armed with legal knowledge and cultural wisdom that will protect ancestral lands for generations to come. Maria Santos won a Pulitzer Prize for her investigation into regional HOA corruption, and her book Suburban Criminals: How HOAs Became Criminal Enterprises became required reading for anyone fighting neighborhood tyrants. Her success proves that journalism still matters when reporters have the courage to follow money trails wherever they lead. But the sweetest victory comes every morning when I float in my lake, watching eagles fish in water so clear you can count pebbles 20 feet down. The sound of loons calling across water that belongs to all Americans, protected by laws older than the corruption that tried to steal it. That phone call from Arizona came last week, another desperate homeowner facing HOA tyranny over a community garden. I smiled, looked across my peaceful lake, and said, I've got some experience with overreaching HOAs. If you've got your own HOA nightmare story, drop it in the comments below. Justice loves company, and corrupt board members hate sunlight. And if this story of fighting back against petty tyrants inspired you, hit that subscribe button for more David versus Goliath victories where the little guy wins and criminals get exactly what they deserve.